Hey, thank you everyone. So we're ready to start. So just let you all know we are recording, and so we'll be posting the event up onto our website as well later on. So any questions or comments, please note you'll be recorded. And I believe that's it from me. So I'll hand over to Eric. Thank you very much.
And I'll be very brief, just to welcome everyone to the at Oxford weekly seminar. I'm Eric Beinhocker, Director of at Oxford. And it's our enormous pleasure to welcome Joe Stiglitz as a seminar speaker. Joe is known to all of you, so all I'll say is he's a professor at Columbia. And Tomohiro Harano, Joe's co-author on this paper. He's an associate professor in the Department of Economics at Royal Holloway, University of London, and a research associate at the Center for Macroeconomics at the London School of Economics, and also affiliated with the Cannon Institute for Global Studies in Tokyo. And the title of their talk is Land Speculation Booms and Busts with Endogenous Phase Transitions, a Model of Economic Fluctuations with Rational Exuberance. And if that doesn't make you rationally exuberant, I don't know what will. So I'll turn it over to Joe and Tomohiro.
Okay, so this is a part of a longer-term research project. We were very concerned with the fact that the standard models with rational expectations seem to give dynamics that did not well describe the fluctuations in the economy. The standard DSG models have things converging on a saddle point much more smoothly. So this set of papers takes the rational expectations model, full employment, all the bad assumptions, and only changes one assumption. And we haven't found a large literature supporting that assumption, but I think it's true. And that assumption is that people live a finite life. That there's not, and people my age, we are more conscious of that finiteness. But that's all that we've done. So we use a standard overlapping generations model with rational expectation. We've added here one more thing: land, a non-produced asset. You might have thought that, given that the OLG model has been around for some 70 years, that there's nothing new more to say. But I hope by the end of the talk, you'll be persuaded that there was a lot more to say. And that's all. That should give you all of you heart that even in areas that have been mined for a long time, just looking at the problem from a little bit different perspective can get a rich set of results. The aspect of OLG models that have been most studied are steady states. And we looked outside of steady states. And many of the standard models, analyses of OLG models, made assumptions that guaranteed that there was a unique momentary equilibrium. And the other thing that we're going to do is to say, actually, under very, very plausible assumptions, there is not a unique momentary equilibrium. So that means that going from the state of the economy today, whatever those state variables are, to the state tomorrow, there's a correspondence rather than a one-to-one mapping. So mathematically, what we're doing is studying the dynamics of correspondences. And that's something that hasn't been done to our knowledge before. So there's a little bit of interesting mathematics in what we're going to do. It opens up a range of dynamics where we can't always predict what is going to happen from T to T plus 1. But there are a range of things that can happen, and we can bound, and so there can lots of fluctuations, different periodicities, or not even periodicities. It's almost chaotic in its nature, but the fluctuations are bounded, and we can describe very precisely the bounds. So we can say a lot about the dynamics, even if we can't say precisely what is going to happen from period to period. And there's a lot of aspects of life that are like that. In genetics, we talk about how viruses change. We can't predict exactly how they're going to change, but we can predict. We can say a lot about those changes, and so that's really the spirit of this paper. So the motivations is that in the real world there are large fluctuations, and many of these are related to real estate. So real estate is going to play a large role. That's why we put land in here, and the characteristic is that there are periods of rising real estate prices, and they're consistent with rational expectations, but rational expectations are such that when prices get too high, the market knows they can't be sustained, and there's a real estate crash. So one of the characteristics, and that's what we call phase transitions, the economy goes from regions where there are single equilibria, multiple equilibria, to regions where there's single equilibrium. And so you can have bullish expectations for a while, then they could turn bearish. And one of the results is they have to turn bearish when prices get too high. So the framework is, as I say, the standard OLG model, but there are now two state variables because we've introduced land. So the two state variables are the capital per capita, and we're going to keep the labor supply constant. So K is both the level capital and the per capita capital, and the price of land. Those are the two state variables. And so we're looking at correspondences between P of T plus 1 and K of T plus 1 and P of T and K of T. The prices go up when people are optimistic. They go down when they're bearish, and they have to switch between bearish and bullish. If they didn't switch, this is where the rational expectations come in. If they didn't switch, in the bullish phase, they would get so high that they would explode, and that would be inconsistent with rational expectations. And when they're bearish, they would get so low that would be inconsistent with rational expectations. And one of the key differences between some of the literature that previously existed is that the interest rate in this model is endogenous. And so that's part of the trick, that the interest rate at which is driving the increase and decrease in the price of land is endogenous. So there are these three phases that can be seen here when between these two numbers here, which I've labeled P hat and P lower bar, there are multiple equilibria. And then there's another phase between P hat and P2 and P max, where you go from multiple equilibria to a single equilibria. And that single equilibria is a crash of an explosion of the unstable upward, and there's a corresponding thing down below. So this is a picture of a kind of a dynamic. Price is rising, and it gets far high enough it has to fall, and then we have another example of it rises, and then before there's still multiple equilibria, it falls. Yeah, so you have these kinds of ups and downs in the economy that are all endogenous. There's there are a number of strands of literature that have touched on some of these things. There's a sunspot literature some of you may know about, but the nature of the sunspot literature, it typically is a economy without capital, and the fluctuations are exogenous to the number of sunspots, and there's always multiple equilibria. Whereas in our model, we have land, we have capital, we have these two state variables, and whether there are one or more multiple equilibria is itself endogenous. And all of you know I'm sure the rational expectation model with individuals living infinitely long, and there's a unique path going into this, consistent with the transversality conditions, consistent with rational expectations forever. It's a unique path. Here we show that given any set of initial conditions, there are an infinite number of paths. And let me just emphasize, we've only changed one assumption, and that is people are finitely lives. We've even kept the very nasty assumption of everybody being identical, except for age. And so it's really a very, very simple model. We've done extensions of this, and the degree of multiplicity of the degree of infinity of equilibria is higher than in this model. So in more general cases, very simple models, you get many more momentary equilibria, much greater possibilities of instabilities. There's another remarkable property of this particular model. One of the unattractive aspects of the standard model is that individuals have to look infinitely far into the future. That's really hard for most of us mortals, even in 2 dimensions. But if you have 1,000 different capital goods, you have to solve a problem of infinite future in all 1,000 state variables. And most of my friends don't solve those problems quickly. And you're supposed to solve them instantaneously. But what's remarkable in our model is you only need to look 1 period ahead. And all you need to do is to say, are my beliefs consistent with rational expectations 1 period ahead, and consistent with their lying within the domains that for which there exists a rational expectations path going forward. Is that clear? So in other words, if given P of T and K of T, I look at P of T plus 1 and KT plus 1, and those variables are consistent with some path of rational expectations, then I'm happy. I don't have to go infinitely far into the future. So all I need to know is enough about the structure of the economy to know whether there is a consistent rational expectations path going forward. So the problem decomposes in time in a very simple way, so that no one has to solve this very difficult infinite problem that you do in the standard DSG model. And so let me show this is sort of the kind of dynamics in an economy without land, where you have for every value of K of T, you have multiple values of K of T plus 1. Okay, so that just gives you the correspondence between, if you know what K of T is, you know what K of T plus 1 is. In some cases, there's only one K of T plus 1, but in other cases, there are multiple K of T plus 1. Okay. And then the nature of dynamics is standard difference equation. You look up, you begin at K naught, you look up what that means for K T plus 1. Then you go over to the 45-degree line, and then you just follow that down and around. And you can see that that gives you an infinite number of paths. Now, what makes this a little bit more difficult is with land, the correspondence between K of T plus 1 and K of T keeps shifting. What the equilibrium value of K of T plus 1 depends on the value of land. And as the value of land changes, that curve changes, and you have to follow all that. So when we first thought about it that way, we said, this is going to be a very difficult problem. And that was a little depressing. But then, as you'll see, we found ways of dealing with this that made it tractable. So this gives you a feeling of our first initial impression that this was going to be a big challenge. I'm not going to go over the model in detail. It's a standard model. People earn wage, live 2 periods. They have a wage when they're young. They don't have a wage when they're old. They save when they're young, and they smooth their income between working the first period when they work and the retirement. Okay, and they maximize their utility given the interest rate. So it's a standard utility maximization problem, which we've written down here, and you solve for the savings function. Now, the interesting property of the savings function in the model of the utility function, Y class of utility functions is satisfied this property. If you are trying to really smooth your income between today and tomorrow, and the interest rate is low, what is that going to mean about how much you're going to have to save? If you're going, you have no income tomorrow, so you have a certain amount of wage today, you want to spread it between today and tomorrow. What that means is that the interest rate is low, you're going to have to save a lot if you're going to have adequate income tomorrow. But if you save a lot and everybody else does the same, what's going to be true about the interest rate? It will be low. On the other hand, if you thought the interest rate is going to be very high, to smooth your income between today and tomorrow, how much do you have to save? Relatively little. But if you save very little, and everybody saves very little, the capital stock is going to be very low, and the result of that is the interest rate will be very high. So it is very natural that in that kind of a world, you're going to wind up with multiple equilibria. Now you have to put that together with a production function, and we have the standard production function, except we have capital, labor, and land. Land is denoted by T, and we normalize the supply of labor and supply of land at 1, and we get then per capita income is just a function of and since land is fixed, it's going to just be a function of K. Okay, So that gives us the two equations that describe the equilibrium. Equation 2 is what I just said before, that the savings investment equation, you have the savings rate, which is a function of the rate of return on capital, times the waging, it's a total income in first period, is it either goes into capital accumulation or into the holding of land. I should say one more thing about that. I should have mentioned individuals in the first period get a wage income, and then they also get another source of income, which we denote by E, just a fixed income. Later, we'll talk about that as like it can be related to like a harvesting of trees, or it can be any, just exogenous, and some of our models we give an interpretation of what that is, but it's something else that you're getting beyond your wage income, and we're for a moment just taking it fixed.
Why do you need that extra thing in the model?
It actually, we vary it a lot, and that affects the nature of the equilibrium.
Thanks.
Okay, so it turns out to be an important parameter, and it's very natural to have it in. So we want, and it turns out it's a critical variable, as you'll see in a minute. Okay. So that's the whole model. Equations 1 and 2 are the two dynamic correspondences, going from K of T and P of T to K of T plus 1. That's equation 2, and equation 1 helps us go from P of T with K of T to P of T plus 1. Is that clear? So that's the whole story mathematically, and the rest of this is sort of working out what the dynamics of that pair of equations are. Okay. Well, the first thing is to look at equation 2 and divide equation 2 by the savings rate, and you get this equation here, and that gives you, if you have P of T and K of T, that determines K of T plus 1. But the interesting thing about it is that in general, there's not a unique K of T plus 1. That's the correspondence. That's the point I talked about before. If you believe that the interest rate is going to be high, your savings rate is going to be very low, and vice versa. So there may be, for any K of T plus 1, multiple values. For any value of K of T and P of T, there may be multiple values of K of T plus 1 satisfying this. The only property that we need is that savings, the savings rate decreases with R. And that's a property, for instance, in a constant elasticity substitution, intertemporal substitution, if the temporal elasticity substitution is less than 1, and we're going to take an extreme case, or if you have target savings of any kind, like retirement. Okay. So are there any questions so far? So here we've just written we've drawn diagrammatically the K equation 2, omega as a function of K of T plus 1, and you can see that there are multiple values that satisfy that equation. And in one of our earlier papers, we went through looking at this for the case without land, and we showed that there are multiplicity, equilibrium when the elasticity substitution is less than 1, and the intertemporal elasticity substitution is also less than 1. So, and these results also hold the plan. So there are, this is not a rare thing to happen. It can happen very easily. Most of what the rest of the paper is focuses on a special case where you have Leontief production function, fixed coefficients, and Leontief preferences. You really want to have the same amount of consumption in the same, or a fixed amount of consumption in the 2 periods. Is that clear? And that makes everything really very simple. It converts the model into a model with just 6 parameters. So you can describe the whole dynamics in terms of 6 parameters of the economy. And here we've diagrammed that omega function for the fixed coefficient model, where omega is linear. Remember, capital omega was this thing here, k of t plus 1 over pt over s of k t plus 1. So we're solving for the particular savings function that and it turns out very simple. It looks like this until you get to the interest rate will either depend whether there's capital scarcity or labor scarcity. So that's why there are just 2 states. And that gives you these 2 linear functions, and that gives you 3 values of the equilibrium and that means you can solve whether you're this gives you exactly the same form of the general case, but the extreme linear form. And if k is low, there's unemployment. If k is very high, capital is unemployed. And what happens here is that when p changes, the whole curve shifts up and down as before. And we then find some critical values as the curves are shifting up. As P2 rises, the omega curve shifts up. And what you can see is that at a critical value of P of t, what happens? You go from multiple equilibria to a single equilibrium. And when P goes down, you go again from multiple equilibrium to the single equilibrium. Those were what we call the phase transitions. So you go from having 3 to 1. So whether there are 1 or 3 equilibrium depends on the value of P. And you're just disappearing. We're just about to have a unique equilibrium. And you got a same very simple picture of the dynamics of price, the arbitrage equation. This is the picture of the arbitrage equation. The 2 different in the case where land yields no dividend, and here's the picture with the land having a dividend, and price goes up. You can describe. See that the point is there are 2 states of the economy. Either capital is superabundant or capital is scarce, and that's going to determine the rate of interest. So you either are in the blue line or the red line. There's a point where it's indeterminate, and that gives you a little bit more complicated story. But so it's either capital scarce or capital surplus, and that determines whether the price of land is going up or going down, whether you're in a boom or a bust. So you have 2 equations. So this is the picture of price going up and this and down. The next one is the case where land has a dividend, and the other one.
So are those arrows zigzag, zigzag, a period by period behavior of the model through time? Is that
Yeah.
what they're showing?
They're showing like take initially you're going up along the red line,
Yeah,
and but then you switch to the blue line. What does that mean? The economy endogenously, we have goes to being in a capital surplus, and in a capital surplus, the return is negative because your capital is depreciating in our model.
because it's gone into the crash state.
It's gone in the crash state.
Yeah,
And now we go down the blue line, and that tells you, you go back to the 45-degree every time. And then you go down until you decide the economy goes back into the shortage. And then it goes back along the red line, okay? So what we're doing is an analysis is in a way mirroring this diagram on the capital arbitrage equation with the earlier diagram on showing how the savings investment equation is shifting up and down. Okay, so that's basically the whole trick of the paper is looking very carefully at the shifting of these two diagrams, which we can do because of that there are some critical variables where you go from three equilibria to one equilibrium. And here we've given these critical points where price hits that can't get below a certain level, can't get above a certain level. There's a period in between where it can go up and down. And that's basically the whole story. There are a lot of ramifications I'll go through, but this is the basic story that this model generates endogenous rational expectations, fluctuations. And all these fluctuations are rational expectations. If the interest rate didn't keep going up and down, those bubbles where it's going up would go up forever. And it's this endogeneity of the interest rate falling that allows the crash to occur. And in fact, it has to occur after price gets a certain level.
so can I ask, can you show that picture of the time process, all the arrows going zigzag, zigzag?
Sure.
Why, when you got towards the top, why does any turkey think it's going to keep on going up? They know that quite soon they're going to lose heaps of money, don't they?
In the rational expectations, no guy believes he can control the interest rate.
Right.
So that's just what he accepts. Now, the market as a whole knows that if they go above a certain point, things will explode.
Yeah.
And so at some point, it has to go down to the blue. It just can't go on, because that would get you would beyond the region in which you could go down. You go on beyond the multiple equilibria into the single equilibria, and then you have to go down. So
but my question is, when you've nearly got to the top, why is it rational to keep on thinking that it's going to go up when anybody looking at this diagram will say, come on, very soon it's going to go down lots and lots?
well, one way of saying, okay, all I need to know is I'm just thinking about today and tomorrow. Is it going to go up? And is there a rational expectations path from that point on, which is consistent with that price? And the answer is yes, there is. Within the region that we're talking about, when you get up there, you still know that there is a rational expectation point. It is a crash. You know there's going to be a crash. But you don't care if there's a crash tomorrow, you're dead already.
Oh, okay, sure.
You're dead.
So that's the point of not living forever.
It's not living forever. So you're dead. And then the people of that day say, I know the price is going down, so I'm arbitraging perfectly with capital because capital is losing value too. Now the capital is getting a negative return in this model because it's in abundance and it's depreciation. You know, it's in superabundance, so it yields no real return, and you lose delta in depreciation, so it's a negative return. So the fact that an important part of this, there has to be depreciation. We can get similar results without that, but that's the easiest case to see that. Okay. There's one more. I'm going the wrong way. Okay. So there's one more point I wanted to make on this slide. There are these infinite number of paths. They're going up and down and fluctuations, bounded. Remember, they're bounded. That's one of the interesting things. So we can say the bounds on these fluctuations very precisely. That was what was given here. We can calculate the bounds P max and P min. So we can say a lot about them. One of the interesting aspects of this is that one of the results in the standard overlapping generations model is that you can't have oversaving. Oversaving means that you have a return that is on capital that is lower than the rate of growth. And the reason for that is, take the example here, where there's no rate of growth, return on capital greater than a return on capital that is less than the rate of growth would be a negative rate of return. What is the present discounted value? Oh, the dividends on land. Land gives us little dividends if the interest rate is negative. Well, it's infinite. So the value of land would be infinite. That would crowd out all capital accumulation, and that would be inconsistent with having an excess supply of land. So some of you may know this has been a big problem. Looking at our current fluctuation right now, real interest rates in the United States are negative, and people said, that's not sustainable. The value of land would be infinite if that were the case. And all our steady state models find that really hard to come to terms with. Well, this model says that's right. We don't expect real interest rates to be negative forever. You have to have a model with fluctuations. So you can't interpret the current situation without embedding it in a theory of fluctuations. There are some other solutions, if we have time, we can talk about, but that's at least critical. So what this model shows is you still can get oversaving, not permanently, but for a number of periods. Is that clear? So that the a real dynamic overlapping generations model is very different from a steady state overlapping generations model. And most of the literature is focused on steady state, and that's wrong. Now, as I said, what's so amazing about this model is it's really simple. It's after you live in it for a long while. And it's an economy described by 5 key production and technology parameters. We've listed them, and 1 taste parameter. And so we can fully characterize all the set of equilibria that exist for each of those set of parameters. What do I mean? We can characterize whether they're wobbly patterns, unique steady state, multiple steady states. We can describe every aspect of the dynamics for all the parameter sets. And the most interesting point, I think, is that there are parameter values that are not unreasonable that for which the only rational expectation equilibria entail wobbly dynamics. So there are parameters for which there exists no steady states, but for rational expectation, steady state with land having value, there exist steady states where land is wiped out. But and we call these completely wobbly dynamics. A way of thinking this is what we've done here is we've taken, as I said, you can describe the economy in terms of these 6 parameters. We're going to keep 4 of the parameters fixed and look at what happens as we change 2 of the parameters. E, the one parameter that we talked about, the amount of income you get exogenously, and the productivity of the economy. And what you see there is the fact that there is a region which we call the completely wobbly region, where the only dynamic is a oscillatory path. And then there are other regions where you can have both a steady state and an oscillatory path.
Joe, if this model completely describes an economy, where does E come from? Does it rain down out of the sky in meteors?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, one way of thinking about it is in this economy, everybody has a little pineapple tree that drops a pineapple tree.
Gardening.
Gardening, yeah. Now there are other versions where we can make that more endogenous, and that you have 2 production functions, a manufacturing production function, and something else giving you another source of income. Okay, and allocating resources between the 2.
Well, then look at your picture and ask, so explain to us why E is so critically important in getting a good, interesting region.
Because it affects the relationship between saving. Remember, the critical thing here are these here. The critical thing is this relationship between the omega, which is going up and down, doesn't depend on E at all. Yeah. And the W, the capital W, which is your wage plus this other source of income, and that moves up and down depending on E. And so whether you have multiple equilibria at any set of land price is going to depend very much on E. Okay, so that's a formal answer. It's not an intuitive answer, but it's a formal answer to the question. Now, we introduced a real estate sector that is more interesting. So far, we've had real estate just having land paying a dividend, okay, a rent. I should have used a rent on land. And now we say, well, what happens when there's surplus labor? Some of that goes to real estate, or there's surplus land, surplus capital, some of that goes to real estate. Is that clear? And so D itself can move depending on which state of the economy is in. Well, the only point about this is that makes the omega function more up and down. And so you go from 3 momentary equilibria to 5 momentary equilibria for some values of P. Okay. You might say, why is that interesting? Well, what we really wanted to illustrate is the multiplicity of equilibria is really deep in this model. You know, we can easily get many more. We have versions of the model where we have 2 classes where people can borrow with each other, and then you get multiple momentary equilibria. So one way of thinking about this is we worked very hard in macroeconomics to ensure that we've had a unique momentary equilibrium. We make very strong assumptions. Well, the reality is, life almost surely, we have multiple momentary equilibria. And whether the number of those momentary equilibria in nature can change very radically. David has written a paper where he's talked a lot about how important multiple equilibria are for macroeconomics. And so this really fits in with your view of the world.
Yes.
And so we've really shown that this is actually the world as we ought to, and economists have really worked very hard to eliminate these possibilities, which are pervasive. And I'm going to say, even in the simplest models, if you make things more complicated, it's even easier to get it. And every time you add a complication, you find out that there are a richer set of multiplicity. So let me one of the versions of the model that we think is quite interesting is when the land yields no dividends at all, no rents. That is a version of the model which is called in the literature a pure bubble, because it's an asset that has no return other than the capital gain. So when the real interest rate is positive, it goes up in value. When the real interest rate is negative, it goes down in value. And all the results that we've described go through for that limiting case. And in fact, in our paper, we begin with that case because it's really very, very simple. You can do all the calculations for the limits much more simply. So what's clear is that our analysis has shown that a laissez-faire macroeconomy can be unstable and inefficient. And then we ask, are there government interventions that would make the economy perform better? And the answer is yes. But you have to be very careful. Not all of what might be called the natural interventions work. So capital gains tax could actually exacerbate things. But
so can you just explain?
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, the reason is, let me say, this is one of those results that is very dependent on the strong rational expectations assumption. And so, I don't believe the rational expectations. This is a disclaimer. This is partly an intellectual fight to show that the DSG models are not robust. If you just change them a little bit to put in this little element of rationality of people being finitely live, every result falls apart. And so you should think of this largely as an intellectual, and a beginning of a research program where we've introduced more other aspects. But within the rational expectations framework, remember what you're doing, a capital tax, capital gains tax, say 50%, is reducing your capital gains by 50%. Therefore, if the returns on land are going to be the same as the returns on capital, the price of land has to go up twice as much so that you get the same net return as you would have had on capital. So your net return has to be exactly the same, so the price has to move a lot more. So this is one of those things when, normally we think taxing capital gains discourages land speculation. That's true in some sense, but that assumes the exogeneity of the price movement. In a rational expectation models, the price movement is itself an endogenous variable. And so this particular instrument doesn't work. And so that's a very general point. In any of these models, any general equilibrium incidence, prices are going to be moving in a general equilibrium way, and you have to think very carefully. It's true, all of Piketty's stuff about the desirability of capital income taxes is flawed because he doesn't take into account the endogeneity of prices and capital accumulation. So a capital tax, the tax on capital, does reduce volatility because then the amount of prices increase that you have to have in land to give for the arbitrage equation is smaller. So that's why, contrary to what you might have thought, a capital tax actually encourages, is good from that point of view because it discourages price movements and the crowding out effect. So it's just the opposite of what you might otherwise have thought. And then there is a much more complicated policy that we won't have time to talk about that actually can achieve full employment, full capitalization, and dynamic efficiency as a unique equilibrium. But that's a little bit more subtle. We've just gone through an example of the fixed coefficient, fixed preferences, and technology, but the results are actually quite robust. And one of the sequels to this, which we won't have time to talk about probably, because I want to open it up for questions and discussion, is we introduce financial frictions in which capital and land are used as collateral. And we do one more thing in that we allow learning by doing, so that when you have, but only in obviously in production. And what we show is that increasing the collateral value of land, making land better used as collateral, leads not, in the Kiyotaki Moore paper, more collateral leads to more entrepreneurship. In our paper, what we show is it leads to land crowding out capital accumulation and less learning. So it's a bad thing for, and this is there is a view that one of the financial reforms of allowing land to be more and more used as collateral has in fact led to increases in prices of land. And that crowds out capital accumulation. And that leads, we can show, to lower economic growth. So it's a model with endogenous growth leading to lower economic growth. Let's see, no, let me stop there.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Joe and Tomohiro. I think we have time for some questions. I'm actually going to start with a question that came from our online participants. Hannah asks two questions. One, what determines land prices and the land dividend? And two, why is the price of land specifically the variable that brings about the change in expectations?
In this model, we treat land as the price of land as a state variable. You begin today with a particular price of land. And by the way, that's a very big difference from the view of most of the models in the literature, where there is only, given K, given the capital stock, in a standard model, there'd only be one unique value of P, the price of land, that would be consistent with going to the saddle point with the long run growth and transversality condition. So knowing K, there is a particular value of P that would generate the long run steady state. That's the standard model. In our model, we say that's not right. You just begin life with a value of P, and the next value of P, so long as it falls within a certain range. If it's too low, it will have to go up, and if it's too high, it'll have to come down. But if it's in its range, there's an infinite number within anything within that particular range will work. And then the next period, it has to satisfy the arbitrage equation. So it is what it is, and it will be what it has to be to satisfy the arbitrage equation. And the problem is that if it's very high, by very high, what I mean is, if it gets very high above P hat, it can't continue, because if it continued, it go from P hat to above P2, and if it goes above P2, it can never return. Because above P2, there's a unique equilibrium, which is a high return equilibrium. With a high return equilibrium, it just gets higher and higher and higher. So when you reach above P hat, but below P2, that the only possible rational expectation is a crash. Knowing that it's a crash, the only possible equilibrium has to be the low return, the low return equilibrium. And that means you save so much that the return becomes negative, in fact. So I hope that answers both parts of the question. The price is what it is, and next period, it will be what it has to be. And if it's very high, it has to be in the crash region. And if it's between P hat and P lower bar, it depends on your mood. And the mood of everybody. If they're bearish, it'll continue going up. If they're bullish, it'll start going down.
So what happens if I'm an orthodox person and I say, come on, these models must have a unique equilibrium? you must have made some fancy special assumptions about the elasticity of substitution or the intertemporal elasticity of substitution. So put my question the other way, are the assumptions that you make about these two parameters compelling enough for someone to want to take this story seriously?
Oh, I think they are. I mean, it's a wide range of numbers. You have to, there are two answers to the question. You know, if you're trying to study the nature of the economy, you want to understand, you know, there's no reason these parameters wouldn't occur. They're not like a counter universe where there's no gravity. These are, you know, the evidence is elasticity of substitution is less than 1. The intertemporal elasticity of substitution is less than 1. There's lots of evidence on all these things. And so it's in the range that's relevant. The other answer I would say is we can get multiple equilibria in so many other ways, you know, that if we have two groups of people, I can get multiple equilibria. You know, we would say that the world normally generates multiple equilibria. And you have worked very hard to get rid of these. Why should I believe you? I would put, you know, switch the burden of proof. Why do you know that you are in that part of the world? Maybe we're lucky where this doesn't happen, but you know, there's no a priori reason why we are in that range. And as I say, once I allow for more than one class of people and other forms of financial bridgings, we've been able to get these multiplicity. So the problem is, I think, much more endemic. Do you want to say anything about that?
No, please. Well, I think what we do is implication of multiplicity of momentary equilibria for global dynamics. Yeah. By focusing on a very standard overlapping generations model. But at the same time, as Joe mentioned, that I think there are lots of model we can get multiple equilibria. And taking those model, if we apply those model to global dynamics, I think we would get similar dynamics.
Yeah, I see. There's a bigger generic message.
Yeah. But this is really, a very generic. As I say, it's sort of as far as I know, the first exploration of global dynamics of models with a correspondence in the momentary, momentary equilibrium, and that seems to me a generic feature of our economy.
Yes, you have a question. So your diagram of the phase transitions suggests that if you're just before a phase transition, the other two equilibria points, they come together, right? And if you go to the phase transition in the other way, the other two equilibrium points come closer together. So how should we interpret that? Is that something that we could observe in the world when two points of equilibria collide?
I don't. I guess. Yeah, that's actually an interesting observation. That it may be that. And I guess the way you look at it is, you look at all sample paths, as K gets to those critical points, the value that you observe in K of t plus 1 must look more similar. Yeah. So that's an interesting empirical test.
So it reminds me a bit about when you're close to a critical point, and you can have very fast fluctuations or something between two equilibrium points or something. So it might be something that you could observe.
Yeah, it could be, I mean, we haven't described, the size of the steps, and those are affected by the parameters. And we haven't considered that the size of the I think I see what you mean, that if you're just above, you could go below, and then you could go back above, and you don't have to go, you can, the point of the multiple equilibrium, you could still go further below and then further below. But there might be, you could see that you could you could have oscillations that would be very, very small oscillations right around that, for certain kinds of the parameters. Yeah, that would be interesting.
And I think if the 2 points are getting closer and closer, then the possibility that the larger clash can occur is getting higher. That means that even if agent choose the middle equilibrium, the price decrease gets higher. So if the 2 points if the price of land continue to rise over time and 2 points are getting closer, that implies that the possibility with larger crash gets higher.
So one of the things we haven't talked about, most of our discussion here was about the dynamics. If you chose one, the upper or the lower equilibrium, there's a whole other set of more fragile dynamics on that middle equilibrium that we haven't talked about, which gives you even more possibilities of multiplicity over in time. That's an important part of the.
Just before I go to you, John, for those listening online, if you have any questions you'd like to put into the room, please go ahead and type a message into the message box, and I'll keep an eye on that. John.
In the model, people don't care at all about their children. If they care just a tiny bit about them.
Was that true? They don't care at all, or they just care less?
In the model, they don't care at all. This is a standard overlapping generation model where, they don't care at all.
Okay.
If they care just a tiny bit, wouldn't that make the whole problem intractable? Because you then have to do the infinite forward solution, even if they only care a tiny bit.
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't an accident that we worked with this, because that really simplified our analysis, enabled us to solve the problem of moving from K of T to K of T plus 1 without thinking of K of T plus 2. And otherwise we would have had to keep track of everything going on, in earlier versions, we thought about that, and that's where we got very depressed. But the results are would be the same of the multiplicity of equilibria. You can sort of imagine that you put very little weight on the future. Then what is really driving your behavior is whether you think that there's going to be a high interest rate this period or the low interest rate this period. So the multiplicity would still dominate, whatever your views of the future. But those views of the future would have multiple values. So this is an example of, I think, I'm just thinking aloud here, if you start thinking about your children may have 3 different trajectories, and their children can have 3 different trajectories. What you can see is the number of trajectories going out into the future gets very, very large. And for each of those trajectories, I now have a savings function. And so the number of decision possible points, all very near each other, because I'm not putting much weight on them, becomes infinite. even today. So the multiplicity is still there, but now it's been increased infinitely.
Just to follow on though, if on the other extreme, if they cared about their children as much as themselves, then it collapses back to a single equilibrium.
That's
right?
back to the DSG.
To the DSG result.
Yeah.
This is the equivalent of an infinitely lived agent.
Exactly. And we have evidence that that's not the way people behave. So
Yes.
we know that that's not the right equilibrium.
Right.
But the point you're making, I think, is really an interesting one analytically. That the point I just made with there being such a rich infinity of equilibria, if there's infinitesimal weight on the future, because that's not really driving my behavior.
Yeah.
And only one equilibrium when there's all the weight, not equal weight on the future, says maybe there must be a point in between, a kind of bifurcation.
Yeah.
Where the nature of the dynamics changes maybe dramatically.
Right.
Or at least the number of sets, the size of the set of the equilibrium gets changed.
Yeah. And of course, we know in the real world, we care about our children somewhat depending on the day of the week. Next question. Anything else? Yeah.
So more on the empirical content, say at the end, interesting to test the model empirically. Do you have some specific predictions you would prepare to test? And I want to ask specifically about so any predictions you have in mind, but I'm curious specifically about the skewness or asymmetry in the business cycle patterns that will go up slowly and crash suddenly as an emerging literature on skewness of the growth rates.
Yeah, well, let me make it in general, I put a lot of caution in the beginning that this is an exercise in pure theory that is mainly aimed at convincing you that you've wasted your time studying DSP. So that's the main point. The reason why I emphasize that is that I think macro models that don't really model having unemployment aren't going to be describing business cycles. I think unemployment, underutilization of resources are an important part of the business cycles, and we haven't really done that in this version of the paper. So I really hesitate. The second thing that we do in the next paper, in some of our other papers, is I think models that try to give a picture of the macroeconomy that don't introduce risk in an essential way are not going to give a good picture. And the reason is the following. I mentioned the real return on government bonds is negative right now, but it's on average, it's been very low, 1.5%. And that has led a lot of people to say, oh, aren't we oversaving? That's not consistent with dynamic efficiency. But the real return on capital is probably more like 7% on average. So you have this big spread between 1.5% and 7%. And I think that has to do with the ability to bear risk and the willingness to bear risk. So you have to have a macroeconomic model that has a safe asset and a risky asset that has sufficient risk that it yields a return that people who could have gotten the 1%, 1.5% return, I chose to get, don't want to go to the 7% return. So the way we've modeled that in some of our subsequent work is, for instance, to say there are two groups of people You have the workers who are very risk averse. And you have the capitalists who are willing to accept higher returns, higher risk in return for the higher returns. So in that simple model, you have the possibility of the workers lending to the capitalists a certain amount, but only only a limited amount, so that there's no risk of default. So you have one asset, a bond that is safe, and another and then an equity that. Well, the point I'm making is that I think any model that tries to capture what is going on in the dynamics of returns has to have these two assets in there, because you don't want to interpret the return on government bonds as the return on capital. And much of the macro, all of them, ESG, do that. And therefore they're just, as a description of the capital market, you get yourself into quandaries that make no sense. It's not like the return on capital is 1.5% or -1%, which is what the return on capital on government bonds real return has been. So if you start focusing on that, you're going to get yourself in trouble.
Excellent. We're out of time, and so just as you say that Joe has a long history of overturning conventional paradigms in economics, and I think this is another another piece of that story, and I think as you said, showing the kind of deep fragilities in this TSG paradigm, and some from very compelling reasons why we need to move beyond it and innovate the way we do macro modeling, particularly when we start talking about the real worlds of policy. And that's very much a mission for many people at INET Oxford in the economics department in this room. So I want to thank you, Tomohiro and Joe, for this very stimulating paper, and look forward to reading more on it. Thank you.